Oh, howdy all, grab yourself a drink, it is time for some PathOfExile discussion. Today I wanted to discuss the Gladiator, which is being overhauled in patch 3.25. This is an ascendancy almost no one plays in patch 3.24, for fairly good reason. It's reasonably good at blocking, it's reasonably good at inflicting damage with bleed, but neither of those things are in a tremendously good spot at the moment. The Gladiator doesn't give enough to make them better than alternatives, and ultimately, it just doesn't do quite enough as an overall package. Currently, I would put the Gladiator in C or C- tier. After the overhaul, it's going to be a B or a B-, so it's definitely better than it was in 3.24, but it's a good way behind the genuinely good ascendancies at the moment, like the Trickster, which I would put in A or A+ tier. That said, the Gladiator does definitely have some strengths going for it. One of the tricky things with the Gladiator is that it has individually tremendously powerful nodes, such as Gratuitous Violence, such as More Than Skill, but it doesn't really have a cohesive whole. For example, you've got War of Attrition, which is not one of the stronger nodes in the game, but that does do something genuinely useful for fighting tougher bosses. This is going to provide you damage when you're fighting a boss, and it's going to do absolutely nothing for your trash clear. Then you have Gratuitous Violence, which is incredible for trash clear, but does absolutely nothing when you're fighting a boss. The problem here is that you're probably going to need to take both of these nodes on a lot of Gladiator setups because they deal with each other's weak spots somewhat. And that puts you in a difficult spot where you're taking two two-pointers that don't really synergize with each other. It's like having two increased damage multipliers on your character rather than having two more damage multipliers. Yeah, it sort of works, but it's much better if they synergize with each other. And this is going to be a continual problem with the Gladiator Ascendancy. The first thing I'm thinking a bunch of you are going to be asking, and I wanted to get this out of the way first, how have I got Path of Building to show the 3.25 ascendancies? Pretty simple thing to do. What you want to do is come into the options menu on Path of Building, which is hiding down in this bottom left corner of the screen, and turn on opt-in to weekly beta test builds. This means that you will get the less tested versions, which includes the 3.25 tree, but will have some mistakes and some nodes will not be complete yet. Save at this point and then click check for update, and you'll find the update that's necessary to get the 3.25 tree. Now, whilst I could run this video from Path of Building, I think it looks a bit better on the Grinding Gear Games website, so let's go over there and discuss the Gladiator's nodes. The core identity of the Gladiator Ascendancy in 3.25, it's good at block, it's good at inflicting bleed, and it's got a few other niche things that you might be interested in speccing into. That's basically where we are, and the problem is going to be finding a cohesive whole. A lot of builds will look at the Gladiator Ascendancy and say, I want this node, I want this node, and I want this node, but then they're going to be asking the question, what am I going to do with my fourth node? If the Gladiator had one universally good two-pointer on it, that you could just say, okay, if you've got 2 points and you don't know what to do with them, take those 2 points, kind of like the Champion's two-pointer that gives 30% increased aura effect. If you had something along those lines on it, then I think the Gladiator would be in a much better spot. But it doesn't have that, and so your last nodes are going to be much weaker. For example, if you're playing a bleed bow build, your first 2 points are tremendous. You get Gratuitous Violence. This is one of the best nodes in the entire game. Your next 2 points are tremendous. You get Jagged Technique. This thing is phenomenal. This thing is a massive damage multiplier. It's far better than a lot of the other alternatives. Your next 2 points are mediocre. You take War of Attrition because it does something, and you want something that does something because that's better than doing nothing. And then finally, you have to take 2 small nodes, because none of the 3 remaining large nodes you could spec, Weapon Master, Measured Retaliation, or Determined Survivor, do anything at all for you. And whilst you will get a little bit out of More Than Skill in some configurations of gear, it's definitely not worth it, and you can't take 4 points there. You're probably taking attack speed, block chance, attack speed, block chance, and that is your fourth ascendancy. Where other people are getting 15% more damage, you are getting 10% increased attack speed and 6% attack block chance, i.e. not very much at all. With that discussion out of the way, let's start talking about the two-pointer nodes first. And let's start with Measured Retaliation, the one that I think is the most build around, but also probably one of the weakest nodes in the game as well. I do think there's a very important caveat that needs to be made before we dig into Measured Retaliation in depth, and that is that this is based upon first impressions of these retaliation skills. First impressions can't tell how well they can overlap an area, how well they can shotgun, all this sort of information. It may be that I am severely underestimating one or more of these skills because they're just better than they look on paper. If that's the case, then this section of the video may age poorly. So let's start by talking about the Retaliation skills package. Measured Retaliation allows you to use Retaliation skills for an additional 2-second window. So normally when you block, if you've got a Retaliation skill off cooldown, then you get to fire it off at any point within the next 2 seconds. If you spec Measured Retaliation, you instead get to fire it off at any point in the next 4 seconds. On top of that, there's a 50% chance for used Retaliation skills to remain usable and not consume a cooldown use, i.e. you can fire another one off immediately if that happens, and you can fire the same Retaliation skill off twice in a row. Now this is going to live or die based upon how the Retaliation skills feel to play. My reason for being a bit apprehensive about these is I've had a look at these. Now Eviscerate looks the best of them, we'll come back to that in a sec. Swordstorm seems to do appreciable damage when there's been video footage of it, but it's going to do a lot of small hits, which doesn't generally synergize well with the bleed that the Gladiator is otherwise famous for, and also requires you to be dual wielding, which is a little bit tricky in a world where shields are so good. It's not that you can't dual wield, and there is other support in the Gladiator Ascendancy for a dual wield playstyle, but I do think that shields are so good, especially in the context of the Gladiator, so I'm not convinced that I'd want to go that way. That said, Swordstorm is definitely worth testing. Eviscerate is worth testing. The one that I'm a bit more confident of saying looks fairly bad is Divine Retribution. The reason I say this is that Divine Retribution requires you to jump through multiple hoops to make it work. In order to make this work, you need to block a hit. That means you need to be in harm's way, and then you get a charge that you can use at any time in the next 2 seconds by default, 4 seconds otherwise. And then that allows you to fire off Divine Retribution, which then does physical damage 50% converted to lightning, and its 390% effectiveness of added damage. I think you want to compare this to Wave of Conviction. Wave of Conviction deals about 20% less damage than Divine Retribution, but it has none of these problems that are associated with Divine Retribution in terms of timing. You cast Wave of Conviction when you want to cast Wave of Conviction, not when the game wants you to cast it. And that is tremendously, tremendously stronger than casting it when the game wants you to. Additionally, you are stuck in the south area of the tree if you're playing this skill on a Gladiator Ascendancy. You aren't necessarily required to be a Gladiator Ascendancy to use it. Retaliation skills can be used by anyone, but in order to get any benefit out of this node, you do need to be in that south area of the tree. And that means that you're not getting as much tree support as a Wave of Conviction build would get. Wave of Conviction also inflicts exposure, which is a benefit that this doesn't have. With all of that in mind, I'm just inclined to say that this is only slightly better than Wave of Conviction, but has massive hoops to jump through in order to make it work. I would be willing to jump through those hoops if the damage gain over Wave of Conviction was 50% more, but when it's more like 20-25% more, I think the answer is no, I'm not interested. I would rather just have a reliable skill, one that I can always use and use on my terms and use before I'm in trouble, rather than one that I have to use only once I am already in trouble. So that's my initial thoughts on the Retaliation skills. Eviscerate, though, just has the numbers that makes me think, oh, this is a little bit better. So this is a skill that can conceivably hit twice. It deals 674.5% of base damage at gem level 1, and I can only expect that this is going to go up, 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 up. But the key thing that makes it really interesting is that it can hit twice. So it fires off 2 waves of force, and enemies that are close to you and in front can be hit by both of them. This is the sort of thing that I'm willing to have as a secondary 4-link on a build, and this is something that might pull me into considering the Gladiator if and only if this gets tested and turns out to be strong. I'm not sold on it yet. I think that the hoops you've got to jump through make it difficult to use on bosses, which are the time that you want the hardest hitting shots, but I'm definitely open to being proven wrong on this, and you can get a lot of block on a Gladiator, so it may well be that you can make this work anyway. It is important to note that this is a slow attack. This is 70% base attack speed, which means it's going to feel like a slam when you use it. It's going to hit like a slam as well, but it's going to feel like a slam to use. So do keep that in mind if you elect to go down this route. So my quick thoughts on the Retaliation skills, I'm completely unsold on them, and for that reason, I am not going to rate Measured Retaliation as a good node. There's actually quite a lot of other support for Retaliation skills on the passive tree as well, and there is 20% more of this stat, this 50% chance for used Retaliation skills to remain usable and not consume a cooldown use. You can get that up to 70%. If you do have 70%, this means that each time you block, you'll get an average of 3 1/3 triggers. So keep that in mind, but all in all, the cooldowns on these, the fact you've got to jump through a bunch of hoops in order to make them work, I'm not convinced. I'm certainly not using them as the only 6-link on a build, and I think the opportunity cost of using one as a 4-link is probably too high. Alright, so that's a measured dismissal of Measured Retaliation. Let's move on to Weapon Master. This is the node I'm going to be the most negative about. It's because it just doesn't do all that much. So let's first deal with a situation where this is at its best, and that is with Varanastra. The problem here is that you're using Varanastra. You are not getting a payoff that is worth using such a bad weapon. It's not that Varanastra is never usable. If you get Varanastra really early in progression, of course you're going to use it, because it's going to be better than any one-handed sword that's under 10 chaos. But once you start getting into crafted rares, they just eclipse Varanastra, even with all of the Weapon Master benefits than Varanastra can get. So 25% more accuracy rating when wielding a sword, that's about 1 glove suffix of power. The Mace or Scepter aspect, the 20% more area of effect, is all upside, but it's important to note that this is 20% more area of effect, which is only the same as about 9.5% more radius. So if you've got a 2.6 meter radius, this is going to take you up to 2.8 meters. Am I going to write home about that? No. I'll take it. I don't mind it, but I definitely don't think that this is worth investing a lot to get. 20% more critical strike chance when wielding a dagger. This is actually pretty good. This could potentially save you 4 or 5 points on the passive tree if you're going critical strikes, or it could save you a flask slot if you're going to use a diamond flask. However, it certainly doesn't make up for using Varanastra, and I don't think it's all that great as something that you're getting for 2 ascendancy points. 20% of leech is instant when wielding a claw. This one is significant, and we'll come back to the one use case for Weapon Master in a sec. Finally, 30% more damage with hits and ailments against enemies that are on low life while you are wielding an axe. This is one of those things that I definitely have overrated in the past. People look at this and say, oh, that's 50% uptime, so that's going to be 15% more damage. Let's run the maths properly instead. Imagine the monster has 130 hit points. You need to do 65 damage to get it down to 65, which is where it becomes low life. Then you need to do 50 damage, which will be scaled up to 65, in order to slay it. So you need 115 damage in order to do 130. In short, this is 13% more damage if you are wielding an axe in general. The other thing that's important to note with this 30% more damage with hits and ailments against enemies that are on low life while you're wielding an axe, this does not scale all that well with other things that escalate how quickly you kill monsters that are already low on life. For example, Culling Strike or the Punishment Curse. This is not something that's bad in conjunction with those, but instead of being 13.1% more damage, it'd be more like 12% in conjunction with Punishment, and more like 10% if used in conjunction with Culling Strike. So there are 3 situations for Weapon Master. The first one is that you're using Varanastra. In that situation, you are getting an entire Ascendancy Notable worth of power out of it. You're actually getting a lot more power than one Ascendancy Notable out of this node, but the problem is that you're then using Varanastra. The only situation which I could see this combination working is if you're using one of the shield skills, and Varanastra is a stat stick for it. But there's other stat sticks you could conceivably use. For example, there is this little rubbish 1-elk unique called the Princess that you could use in that situation for 30% physical damage added as extra cold damage, which is something you could use instead of Varanastra if you were using a shield skill. And then at that point, you don't take Weapon Master because Weapon Master is not offering you very much. You go and spend those points elsewhere, and I think you come out ahead over the option of going Varanastra and a shield alongside it. So don't think Varanastra is the way to go. The next option that you've got is dual wielding 2 different weapon types. There's a number of reasons that this can work well. There is some support for using a sword and an axe together, and the sword one is reasonably good, the axe one is reasonably good. If you are already willing to commit to using a sword and axe on your character, then Weapon Master will give you a full Ascendancy points worth of power. But the question is, are you set on using a sword and an axe? If you're not set on using a sword and an axe, then not having Weapon Master and spending the points elsewhere gives you a bit more flexibility. Essentially, this is asking a lot of you, and it's not paying off a huge amount. The third scenario is you're using Weapon Master and you are axe and board, or sword and board, or claw and board. In this situation, I don't think there's anything that's particularly great, especially given that whilst you do get a really powerful effect in that 20% of leech is instant while wielding a claw, this is an incredibly powerful effect, but the thing is you're wielding a claw, you can already get this from a mastery. The only sorts of weird edge cases where that becomes really good is if you're using a claw, but the actual source of your damage is not the claw, it's your shield. And in that case, yeah, you're getting something out of Weapon Master, but I'm not sold on it being worth an entire Ascendancy to get that 20% of leech instant on your shield skill. So essentially, I'm not sold on Weapon Master in general. I don't think it offers very much. I also think it's really egregious that there's no support for bows on this, because bow bleed is one of the things that people have been playing with the Gladiator for a while, and having something that plays the bow strength would fit really well in here, especially given that the defensive aspects of the Gladiator offer nothing to a bow-based character as well. So Weapon Master, don't take it. Next, we'll talk about War of Attrition. This one's interesting because I've been seeing a lot of people extremely negative about this on Reddit, and they're partly right and they're partly wrong. This is a node that is tailor-made for one situation, and that is your first Maven fight, your first Uber Elder fight. This is not for doing a boss the 18th time. This is for doing a boss the first time, because this is going to give you a considerable boost to power in long fights, but it's going to give you very little boost to power in short fights. Let's look at the numbers a little bit. Let's say that your time to kill on a boss is 300 seconds, and that is completely smooth. This would be a bit of an unusual situation to people whose experience in killing bosses takes place a bit later in the league. Something quite different happens on day one of a league, and it's really insightful to have a watch of some of the video footage that came out of the race event that Jung Rowan ran a few days ago, where the eventual third place getter spent something like 8 or 9 or even 10 minutes fighting the Maven. And the reason for that was that they did not elect to put off the Maven until their character was powerful enough to smash it. Instead, they were like, right, I'm going for it right now because I think I can get there, and they actually did succeed in getting there. But it was a long, tense, and difficult fight. War of Attrition absolutely shines in a scenario like that. So that's where it's at its best, that's where you want it. The key thing with this though is that this is a node you outgrow. When you outgrow it, you unspec it and you take something else instead. It's a little bit different if the only thing you're fighting is Uber Elder. Like if you're doing Uber Elder day in, day out, then this node's always going to be good because you're basically always in the presence of 2 bosses the whole time. And there's also a number of cutscenes that you can't really speed up in the fight. But all in all, War of Attrition is something you probably take early on as your 4th node on basically every Gladiator. Then you unspec it once you stop doing bosses that take a long time, which is something that every efficiency-minded PathOfExile player eventually does, some people faster than others. So that's all of the isolated 2-point nodes. Let's have a look at the 4-point sections, and let's start with the block side. The block side has one of the best defensive 4-pointers in the game, more than skill. And some of the power of the 2-point node is tied up in the fact that it allows you to access the 4-point node. Those of you that are familiar with the previous version of the Champion's Fortify node will know that the same thing applied there. The 2-pointer node, although it was really good early in progression, it ended up falling off really hard, but that was fine because you were happy to pay 4 points for Fortitude, and the fact that you got something else halfway along the line was a bonus. It didn't need to be worth 2 points, it wasn't worth 2 points, but it was something that you took as a bonus because it was there. More than skill is exactly that. Chance to block, attack, or spell damage is lucky if you have blocked recently. So let's talk Versatile Combatant. Versatile Combatant has a text minus 10% to maximum chance to block attack damage, minus 10% to maximum chance to block spell damage, plus 2% chance to block spell damage for each 1% overcap chance to block attack damage. So this overcap text, this refers to any wasted attack block that you've got. So what this allows you to do is it allows you to get 65% attack block, 65% spell block much easier than pretty much anything else in the game. Once you've got 65% attack and spell block, More Than Skill is going to raise that up to 87.75% as long as you've blocked recently. The best thing though is that if you haven't blocked recently, you're probably at full life, except for one unlucky situation you can get into, and we want to quickly address that now. That unlucky situation is that the first time you're hit in a combat, it goes through that 65% chance to block, and you take full damage from it. And then that first attack or spell is followed up by a second one. This second one you will not have the benefits of lucky block against, but you will also not be at full life. So this is the one time that this can be sketchy. What More Than Skill does is it mitigates damage more than anything else in the entire game, but it does so in a way that's very spiky. So if your block chance is 25%, the lucky chance is 43.75%. If you were taking a whole bunch of small hits, instead of taking 100 of those small hits to kill you, it's going to take that 100 plus an extra 77 or 78 on average. If your block chance is only 30%, then that's 51% lucky. Instead of taking 100 small hits to kill you, you're now looking at 204. The problem though, is that you can get in situations where you just get a really bad unlucky streak, and that can put you on the ground. The thing is though, that the numbers are so good on More Than Skill, that especially once you start looking at getting 60% or higher block chance, you start requiring a tremendous amount of these small hits, and effectively it makes you almost completely immune to them. And at the same time, it makes you pretty resilient against the big, chunky, scary hits, unless you take a lot of them in rapid succession. This is very strong, and I'm going to highly recommend it, and it's also going to be something that will be extremely good to pull in on other ascendancies through the use of Forbidden Jewels. In fact, that may be the single best use of the new Gladiator. It's to pull in more than skill onto the champion, and the champion has a number of other things going for it defensively that mean that it can make even better use of this, that put it into a really strong defensive position to weather some of the hits when it doesn't end up proccing this. The other thing is that the Gladiator has exactly 0 mitigation for damage over time, and that's going to be the thing that will probably actually kill you in practice. So in summary, more than skill is going to make you incredibly tanky against small hits. You will never die to porcupines with Gladiator's more than skill active on your character. However, at the same time, you'd want to get out of desecrated ground pretty quickly, because you could find yourself in for a world of hurt if you stand in that for any period of time. I know I'm talking about the weaknesses of this node a lot, but I do think that this is one of the most powerful defensive nodes in the entire game. It has weaknesses, but it's going to make you feel like a god when you're mapping. The node that leads up to it is Determined Survivor. If you are using a shield, this overwrites the block chance that is listed on your shield with the number 50%. For example, if you have Aegis Aurora, this has chance to block 32% printed on it, so just pretend that it doesn't say 32%, pretend that it says 50% instead. That is what this particular notable is going to do. If you are not using a shield, but you're dual wielding, inherent bonuses from dual wielding are doubled. Now these inherent bonuses, this is 10% more attack speed. So you go from having 110% base attack speed to 120%, which is approximately a 9% more multiplier to damage. And you go from 20% chance to block attack damage up to 40% chance to block attack damage. It does something real. It gives you about 20% attack block, varying depending upon the shield that you're using. And it gives you 9% more attack speed if you happen to be dual wielding. There is a shield called Broken Faith that is quite powerful and that has as a balancing factor on it that its chance to block is really bad. The block chance on this Archon Kite shield is exactly 12%, but that 12% is going to be overwritten by the number 50 if you elect to use it in conjunction with Determined Survivor. I don't think this is necessarily a great deal, because Broken Faith, whilst it does have some good things going for it, it's not like it plays well to everything the Gladiator is doing, but it does have some synergy, and I thought I had to mention it here. Alright, so that's the block aspects of the tree. I do think that this package, Determined Survivor and More Than Skill, as well as a shield, is a pretty solid defensive setup. One thing that you'll notice though, there is no support for staff block here at all, and that is something I think is a missed opportunity on the Gladiator. I would really like to have seen some support for using a War Staff, although I think that the Slayer is still going to be the most popular build for using a War Staff, because Slayer Cyclone is actually in a fairly good place, as far as I see it, in 3.25. And now we get to the best node on the Gladiator Ascendancy. The reason that the Gladiator Ascendancy is better than it was in 3.24 is because this node is so much better. For 2 points, Gratuitous Violence is going to cause every bleeding enemy you kill to explode, and it's going to deal 20% of its maximum life as physical damage, and this physical damage can then be scaled with all sorts of things, such as physical damage added as extra cold, were you to use this meme weapon. That is not something I'd recommend, but I do think I want to point it out as an example of some of the scaling that's available to you. I do want to point out though that Gratuitous Violence as it exists in 3.25, it's better at clearing than it was in 3.24, and it's 2 points cheaper than it was in 3.24, but it does lose one very important thing: 20% more physical damage over time. That was universal more damage over time with physical stuff, so that worked with Corrupting Fever. All the Corrupting Fever Gladiator synergies are gone, and it also applied to bleed. So this is no longer going to power up your bleeds, but there's a new node that is going to do that, which we'll get to in a sec. This is one of the best explosions available in the game. You do need to be triggering bleed, but you don't need to specialize in bleed for this to be good. All you need is to have a reasonably high chance to inflict bleed. To answer the most commonly asked question I've seen about Gratuitous Violence, because it's dealing physical damage, can that physical damage further inflict bleed, and can this then cause chain reactions? The answer to that is no, because the physical damage that's done by Gratuitous Violence is not weapon attack damage, and therefore it is incapable of applying bleed. So Gratuitous Violence is something that's a big bonus. It's something that's going to pull people into trying the Gladiator Ascendancy. It's probably one of the best 2-pointers in the game, and it's probably going to be something that's very popular on Forbidden Flame and Forbidden Flesh duels, but it's not completely unconditional, and you do need to inflict bleeds on things in order to get these satisfying pops out of them. And finally we have Jagged Technique, which is one that I've seen a lot of arguments about on the PathOfExile build subreddit. Bleeding you inflict is aggravated. Aggravated bleeding treats the target as being moving all of the time. So bleeding that's been aggravated always deals higher damage as though the target was moving. And just to clarify, this is a triple damage effect. So this is 3 times the amount of damage per time, 200% more if the target is moving. You would get this anyway without aggravated bleed if the target happened to be moving, but with this, you get it when they're stationary as well. This does not appear to work in conjunction with Crimson Dance, because with Crimson Dance, the fact that the enemy is treated as moving doesn't matter, because moving doesn't cause the target to take extra damage. So yes, it is still considered to be moving by Crimson Dance, but it still does the base damage that a Crimson Dance bleed would do. All that said, there are builds that want this, there are builds that don't. The key thing is, are you critically striking with the attack that delivers bleed? If you are, then you've got alternatives to Jagged Technique. There is support on the passive tree for 50% chance to upgrade bleeds to aggravated bleeds when you inflict a critical strike with an attack on a target. So that enemy already needs to be bleeding, and then those existing bleeds can be upgraded to aggravated bleeds if you land another crit on that target while that bleed is still running. If you've got a reasonably good chance to inflict critical hits, then this is going to add up, and this is going to mean that you don't need to take the Gladiator Ascendancy node that guarantees aggravated bleeding. However, if you are not using critical strikes to inflict your bleeds, and you don't have at least that 30 or 40% crit chance, then Bloodletting is not going to substitute here. Bloodletting only grants 10% chance to aggravate bleeding on targets you hit with attacks, and I don't think that that's enough to matter really all that much. It will be a bonus. You're going to take Bloodletting on a bleed build whether or not you've got the Aggravation Ascendancy node, but it's not going to be something that's going to substitute because 10% is just too low. With a 10% chance to aggravate bleeds, you'll frequently go 5 seconds, 10 seconds without getting a single aggravate. There's also a number of bleeding masteries that interact with aggravate in various ways. 25% chance to aggravate bleeding on targets you hit with exerted attacks. You'll know whether this is useful to you or not. I think in most cases it's probably not going to be enough, because if you're making exerted attacks, you're probably attacking pretty slowly, and as a result, you're not necessarily going to aggravate every bleed that you hit. Then we have attack hits aggravate any bleeding on targets that have already run for 4 seconds of their duration or more. This has a couple of real problems with it. Firstly, it has terrible anti-synergy with the stat bleeds you inflict deal damage faster. You can't get a huge amount of this stat, but it is a really good stat on bleed builds, and it is completely anti-synergistic with this mastery. Secondly, you then need to invest in increased duration of bleeds. If you get a bunch of that already, then you will find there's a bit more use out of this attack hits aggravate any bleeding that's older than 4 seconds mastery, but otherwise, I'm just not sold on it. And finally, there's the stun one. 50% chance to aggravate bleedings on targets you stun with attack hits. I can see this one having some use cases, and I can see this being enough in some situations, but it will take considerable investment in stuns, and it's also going to be something that's going to make the first 20 seconds or so of fights against bosses much worse than they'd otherwise be, because firstly, you've got to hit them once in order to inflict a bleed, then you've got to hit them again in order to aggravate that bleed, and that hit's got a stun, maybe you don't succeed in stunning, and you've also got to build up towards War of Attrition being at a point where it can help you inflict that stun, because maybe you're not inflicting a stun to begin with. So all of the sources of aggravation of bleeding that are on the classic passive tree are, in my opinion, pretty lackluster. It's not they do nothing, it's that they aren't reliable enough, and so I'm just not sold on them, especially because one of the worst things you can have happen is that you hit an enemy like a wet noodle, because your first hit's going to do very little damage, it's not going to be aggravated under any circumstances, and then you're running around for a while, waiting for a couple of monsters to die, so that you can regain control of the fight. That's going to happen a bunch if you're playing a Gladiator and you don't have this automatic aggravate. So let's say that you do take Jagged Technique, this is going to be an enormous boost to the damage that you do in the first 4 to 5 seconds of a fight, and then that's going to start tapering off over time. Remember where we started? We're talking about how one of the weaknesses with the Gladiator is that there's a bunch of nodes that sort of feel like they're at cross purposes. Jagged Technique is a really good damage node. It's going to triple your damage early on, but it doesn't triple your damage later in the fight. It's just something that's a little bit of a boost later in the fight, because later in the fight, some of those conditional aggravation nodes are more likely to be functioning for you. While at the same time, War of Attrition does nothing early on, and then becomes much better later. You've got these two things that are running at cross purposes to each other, and even though they're both individually fairly good, you end up without a cohesive whole in the Gladiator Ascendancy. That's why I'm not willing to give this anything higher than a B or a B- to begin with, unless it turns out that these retaliation skills are considerably better than I'm expecting, in which case the Ascendancy setup is just going to look like this. Your first point is measured retaliation, your second, determined survivor, your third, more than skill, and then after that you take whatever you want out of the remaining options, Going to really depend upon your playstyle, but they all offer something. Gratuitous Violence is the one that you would default to as long as you've got reasonably good chance to inflict bleed, but you don't necessarily need to go that way. You can do something else. There is definitely a cohesive setup in a character that's based around that on the Gladiator, but it's going to live or die based upon whether these retaliation skills are good. So to finalise, if you're dead set on playing a Gladiator because you like the class fantasy, I don't think the game will completely destroy you for doing it. You're not going to feel punished, but you're also not necessarily going to feel rewarded. And what's really missing for the Gladiator in order to make it something a little bit more of an all-rounder is to just have 2 more points that are something that you can pick up on builds that can't find 8 good points in this ascendancy. That's all I got on this. May your Varlobs have interesting results, and I will see you around.